I argued against God for 31 years, loudly, in rooms that didn't want it. Then my heart stopped, and I came back with something I still can't explain away. Before this is over, you'll hear the exact sentence I used to mock believers, said back to me by something that had no way of knowing it. I'm not going to tell you what I believe now. I'm going to tell you what happened. I like the sound of my own certainty. That flat, clean sound a fact makes when it lands and ends a conversation. My sister sat through it every holiday. The last time I told her there was nobody listening, she didn't argue. She looked at the table. 12 days later, I was on a floor in Ohio with 3 strangers counting over my chest. 6 minutes. That's what the report says. 6. What I lived was not 6 minutes, and when I came back, the first thing I noticed wasn't the light, or the tunnel, or any of the things you've heard from people like me. It was the sound. Something in the sound had changed. Something in the sound had changed. But that sentence means nothing to you until you know what the sound was before. Before, sound was measurement. I inspected parts for a living. 31 years in a shop outside Cleveland running a gauge over steel and telling men with more seniority than me that they were off by 0.004 of an inch. I was right almost every time. That was the whole architecture of me. Not cruelty, accuracy. And accuracy has a sound. It's the click a caliper makes when the jaw closes and there's nothing left to argue about. I brought that click home with me. I brought it to dinners, to funerals, to the hospital room where my father spent his last week asking for a priest. I told my sister the priest was theatre. She was 19, I was 26. She never forgave me for it, and she never once said so, which is worse. There's a reason I'm telling you about Marianne before I tell you about the floor. Hold on to her. People assume this happened in a hospital. Everyone assumes hospital because that's how these stories usually start. It didn't. It happened in my own kitchen on a Tuesday with a dish towel still over my shoulder. The run sheet says the call came in at 9:47 in the evening, Cleveland Heights. 12 minutes from the call to the front door. That's on the report, and I've read it more times than I'd admit to a stranger. What the report doesn't say is that Marianne was already dialing before I went down. She won't explain it. I've asked her 4 separate times in 4 different years, and she gives me the same answer with the same flat face. I just knew. That's not evidence, I know it isn't. 9 years ago I would have taken that sentence apart in front of company and enjoyed doing it. But I need you to hold both things at once, because I did. And it's the reason I'm still not comfortable in my own life. My sister called for help before there was anything to call about, and the man she called it for had spent 3 decades explaining to her that there is nothing on the other side of anything. Here's the part that matters, and it isn't the mystical part. It's the ordinary part. I wasn't unhappy. That's what nobody expects. I wasn't a bitter man drinking alone in a dark house, waiting to be corrected by the universe. I had a decent job. I had a boat I never used. I had a marriage that ended quietly in 2009 for reasons that were mostly my own and mostly about certainty. What I had, instead of a wound, was an absence. And absence doesn't announce itself. There was no room in me for anything I couldn't put a number to. Not for my father's last week. Not for the way my ex-wife used to stand in the doorway at night before she stopped standing there. Not for Marianne sitting across a table from me every holiday taking it. I had never once been wrong in a way that cost me something. That's the sentence I'd give you if you asked me what my life was missing. Not God, not meaning. I'd been wrong plenty about torque specs and tolerances, but I had never been wrong about something that mattered in a way I couldn't measure my way out of. I am 43 years old, and I am standing in that kitchen with a dish towel over my shoulder. The water is still running. There's a smell of lemon soap, and under it the cold penny smell that comes off a sink drain in an old house. My left arm feels wrong in a way I decide is nothing. I decide it's nothing for 11 seconds. I know it was 11 because I counted them. Out of habit, I count everything. And then the counting stopped, meaning what counting means. That's the last measurement I ever fully trusted. Then the floor. And here's what I want you to understand before we go any further, because it's the crack that everything else came through. I did not go looking. I had no near-death curiosity, no shelf of books about the light, no half-secret hope I'd been hiding from myself. I was the least prepared man in Ohio for what happened next, whatever this was. It did not need my permission, and it did not begin with a light. It began with someone saying my name, my whole name, the one nobody has used since my mother stopped using it, in a voice I had heard before, somewhere I could not place. I spent 9 years trying to place it, and the night I finally did. I sat down on the stairs in the dark and stayed there until morning. I'll get to the voice. I have to get you to the floor first, because everything after depends on you believing the floor was ordinary. It was. That's the part people don't want. There was no warning that felt like a warning. There was a wrongness in my left arm that I filed under, sleeping badly, and then a pressure behind the sternum that I filed under the sandwich I'd eaten standing up at the counter. I was 43 years old that year, and I had the blood pressure of a man who has been told twice and adjusted nothing. The dish went first. I remember the plate leaving my hand more clearly than I remember falling. It hit the edge of the sink and broke into 3 pieces, and the sound of it was the last sound I heard from that side. Then the linoleum against my cheek, cold, gritty in a way that embarrassed me, because I had told myself I kept that floor clean. And this is where I want to be careful with you, because if I dress this up, you'll stop trusting me, and you'll be right to. I did not see a light in my kitchen. I did not feel peace. I felt annoyance. My last fully human thought was that I was going to be late for a shift, and my second to last was a flare of pure animal fear that had no words in it at all. Ray Kessler lived on the other side of my wall for 11 years. He heard the plate. He told the paramedics he heard the plate and then heard nothing at all, and it was the nothing that got him off his couch. He found the door unlocked. It was never unlocked. I want you to sit with the arithmetic for a second, because I couldn't for years. Marianne dialed before I went down. Ray came through a door that shouldn't have opened, and I was on that floor by myself in a house where I had spent 3 decades explaining to anyone who'd listen that there is no one arranging anything. The run sheet is a document. Anyone can request one. Mine says asystole. No rhythm at all, a flat line, not the shockable kind you see on television. It says 3 rounds. It gives a down time of 6 minutes and 40 seconds before they got anything back. The medic who worked on me was named Dale. He came to see me twice after, which I'm told is unusual, and the second time he sat on the edge of a hospital chair with his hands between his knees and asked me a question I've never answered publicly. "Do you remember me talking to you?" I said no. That was a lie. I've been carrying it for 9 years. He asked it the way a man asks something he already suspects. He didn't push. He put his hands back between his knees and looked at the floor tile for long enough that I understood he had a reason for coming, and that the reason was not me. I've thought about that visit more than I've thought about the light. Here's what I can tell you honestly about the crossing itself, and it is not what I expected to be able to tell you. It was not a tunnel. Everyone calls it a tunnel. It wasn't. It was a change in acoustics. You know the feeling of walking from a carpeted room into an empty one, how the room tells you its size before you look? That. Exactly that. But the room was the size of everything. And I had gone from inside a body, which is a small, loud, echoing space, all pulse and blood hiss and jaw noise, into a place with no walls to return anything. Nothing came back, nothing bounced. And here's what I didn't know while I was standing in that quiet, taking my time, marvelling at the acoustics like a man in an empty church. Back in the kitchen on the linoleum they had stopped. Not paused, stopped. Ray told me later that one of them stood up and stepped back and looked at the clock on my stove, and that nobody said anything for a few seconds, and that those few seconds were the longest of his life. I was somewhere with no walls, unhurried, curious, and the men around my body were already deciding how to write it down. For a man who had built his entire life on the click of a caliper closing, that silence should have been terror. It was not terror. It was the first honest quiet I had ever been inside of, and some part of me that I did not authorize recognized it. And then, from somewhere in that quiet, someone said my name. Not the short version, not the one on my paycheck. The whole thing, the 4 syllables my mother used when I was small and in trouble, and loved anyway, syllables nobody alive had put together in that order in over 20 years. And I did what any man would do, which is the one thing I still can't forgive myself for. I turned toward the sound, and I said no. I said no. Understand what that means coming from me. It wasn't courage, it was reflex. 31 years of practice at refusing the thing I couldn't measure, and the habit outlived the heartbeat by a considerable margin. And the moment I refused, I was back in the kitchen. Not in my body. Above it. About the height of the cabinet tops, off to the left, near the window, over the sink. I've read enough since to know how that sentence lands. It lands like every other account you've heard, and I resented that for years, because I wanted my experience to be original, and instead it was ordinary, and ordinary is much harder to explain away than original. So let me give you the parts nobody puts in the books. I was not floating. Floating implies a body doing the floating. There was no orientation. I wasn't above the room, so much as the room was arranged below me, the way a thought is arranged. And I could see the top of the refrigerator. That's the detail I gave the hospital chaplain the first time anyone asked me anything, and I gave it to him because it was the least mystical thing in my head. The top of my own refrigerator. 9 years of dust, a jar lid, a plastic salad spinner blade that had gone missing in 2011 and that I had accused my sister of throwing away. I am 5'8". I had never in my life seen the top of that refrigerator. Marianne found the blade 3 days later, exactly where I told her to look, standing on a step stool, holding her phone, not saying anything for a long time afterward. That's not a message from the beyond. It's a piece of plastic. It's also the reason I can't get out of this. I tried to tell Ray I was fine. That's the part I've never said out loud to anyone but my sister. I tried. I aimed something at him. Not words, there was nothing to make words with, and I understood in the same instant that I had nothing left that could reach him. Not a mouth, not a hand, not the volume I'd spent my whole life relying on. The loudest man in any room, and the room couldn't hear me. There were 4 people in my kitchen, Ray in the doorway with both hands on his own head, an old man's gesture, the one you make when you don't know where to put your hands, 2 medics, and the one they called Dale, on his knees, working. I could hear all of them without effort. That's the second thing the books get wrong. It wasn't that my hearing improved, it's that I had lost the walls I told you about. Nothing bounced, nothing arrived late, nothing had a direction. Ray's breathing and Dale's counting and the compressor sound of my own chest under someone's hands arrived at me the way a fact arrives, all at once, already understood. And there was a phone number written in ballpoint pen on the inside of Dale's left forearm. I want to be exact here because exactness is the only currency I ever had. I did not read the digits. I have never claimed I read the digits. What I saw was that there was a number in blue ink smeared at the end. 11 days later, in a hospital chair, that man asked me if I remembered him talking to me, and I lied and said no. And then I asked him, as casually as I could manage, whether he wrote things on his arm. He pulled his sleeve back without a word. I've thought about why I lied. I think it's because a truthful answer would have obligated me to a conclusion, and I was still, even then, negotiating. Because here's what Dale said while he was working on me, not to me, to the other medic, low, the way men talk when they've already made a decision and are just waiting to say it out loud. He said, "He's gone." 2 words. Flat, not cruel, tired, the tone a man uses about whether he can't change. And I heard it and I understood it, and here is the thing I've never been able to make anyone understand. I agreed with him. I looked down at the man on that floor, at the dish towel still hooked over his shoulder, at the 3 pieces of plate by the cabinet, and I felt exactly what I would have felt looking at a part that had failed inspection. That's it then. That one's finished. No grief, no panic. A machinist's shrug from 6 feet above my own life. And that is the moment. Not the voice, not the light, not anything that came after. That is the moment I still wake up at 4 in the morning thinking about. Because if there was nothing on the other side of anything, who exactly was doing the agreeing? I didn't get to finish that thought. Something behind me had been waiting for me to have it. Something behind me had been waiting, and when I finally turned toward it, the quiet changed. It didn't get louder, it acquired a direction. That's the closest I can put it. Until that moment, the silence had been even all around, the way water is all around. Now it had a source. There was somewhere it was coming from, and everything in me that had ever pointed at anything pointed there. People want me to say light. There was light. But calling it light is like calling a man's whole life his shoe size, technically accurate and completely useless. What it was the place the sound was coming from. And the sound had no volume and no words. And I understood it the way you understand your own name. And that is where the flaw came out from under everything I had ever believed about myself, because I had been there before, not somewhere like it, there. The same quiet, the same direction, the same terrible attention pointed at me and waiting. I was 21 years old, the night after my mother was buried, sitting in the bed of my uncle's truck in a field off Route 87, because the house was full of people eating ham. And it came for me. That's the only honest verb. The quiet came for me, out of a February sky with no help in it at all. And for something like 10 seconds, I was inside the exact acoustics I would not stand in again for 22 years. And I want to tell you I was moved. I want to tell you I felt held. I was terrified. I was 21, and my mother was under new dirt, and something enormous had just turned its face toward me, and I did the only thing a boy in that field could do. I made noise. I got down out of that truck and I went back inside, and I started an argument at my own mother's wake about the resurrection with her sister. I remember my aunt's face going white around the mouth, and I remember feeling the click, that clean closing, nothing left to say click for the first time in my life. And it worked. That's the part I need you to hear, because everyone assumes a man like me arrived at his position through thought. I didn't. I arrived at it through relief. The noise worked. The quiet went away. And I made sure it never got a foothold again. Not at dinners, not at funerals, not in a hospital room where my father spent his last week asking for a priest. 31 years, I called it reason. It was soundproofing. Every argument I ever won was a nail in a wall I was building against a thing I had already met once and could not survive meeting twice. And now I was standing in it with no body to make noise with, and the wall was gone, and it was still there. It had never gone anywhere. It had been on the other side of every word I ever said. And here is what undid me, standing there with nothing left to build a wall out of. It wasn't angry. I had assumed, in whatever way a man assumes things he insists don't exist, that if I was ever wrong there would be a bill. That's the shape of it in the mind of somebody like me. You're wrong, you pay. The ledger closes. At least it's clean. There was no ledger. There was attention. Complete. Unhurried, entirely on me. The way a man looks at his son across a shop floor when the boy has just ruined an expensive piece of stock, and the man is deciding in that second that the stock doesn't matter. 31 years of arguing against something, and it turned out I had never once described it correctly. I need to give you one more thing, and then I'll stop, because this is the hardest paragraph in this story for me. 4 years after that kitchen floor, Marianne told me something she had held for 2 decades. Our father, in that last week, the week I called theatre, was not asking for a priest. He was asking for someone to bring him a priest so he could send a message to me. She was 19. She was in the room. She heard it. And she never told me, because by then I had trained everyone I loved to keep certain sentences to themselves. I asked her what the message was. She told me she'd tell me when I was ready to hear it. And then she went out to her car and sat in my driveway for 40 minutes before she drove away. It took her another 5 years. And when she finally said it in my kitchen, standing about 4 feet from where I went down, it was word for word what I had already been told on the other side by whatever was waiting for me in that quiet. I'm going to make you wait for it. Not to be clever, because you need to know what it cost me first. What it cost me started immediately. And it started with me doing what I do. I tested it. That's not a confession of arrogance. It's the only tool I had ever been issued. A man hands me an object. I put a gauge on it. Something enormous turns its attention on me in a place with no walls, and I reach for the gauge, because the gauge is the last piece of me still working. So I asked it a question with a checkable answer. I want to be honest about how small the question was. I didn't ask what happens to us. I didn't ask why there's anything instead of nothing. I asked it to tell me something I could verify when I got back. A number, a name. Anything I could carry out and lay on a table in front of my sister and say, "Here, weigh this." And it gave me an answer. It gave me an answer immediately, without hesitation, and I understood the answer completely in the moment I received it. And I cannot tell you one word of it, not because I'm holding it back, because it did not survive the trip. It's the only part of the whole experience that came back damaged, the one part I asked for on my own terms, the one part I demanded in my own currency. Everything I was given I still have. The one thing I tried to take I lost. That was the first failure, and it made things worse because now I was frightened. So I did the next thing. I tried to name it. And this is where I have to disappoint anyone hoping for a conversion story with a tidy vocabulary, because the word came into my mouth, the word I had spent 31 years taking apart in front of company, and the moment I reached for it, the attention did not recede exactly, but something in it grew patient in a way that humiliated me. The way a grown man goes quiet and lets a child finish. The name was too small, not wrong, small, like handing somebody a caliper and asking them to measure the ocean and having them accept it politely because you're trying. Second failure. Worse than the first, because now I understood that my entire equipment was not being rejected, it was being outgrown in front of me in real time, and there was nothing left of my life that I could set against it. So I tried the last thing. I tried to look at it directly. You cannot. It's not forbidden. I want to be clear. Nothing in that place forbade me anything. It's structural. It was in the direction that seeing comes from. Trying to look at it is like trying to turn your head fast enough to see the back of your own eyes. And in the trying, I felt the first thing I would call pain. Not physical. I had no body to hurt. It was the pain of a man who has just understood that he has been holding a conversation his entire life with his back to the room. 3 failures. And here's what each one took from me, in order. The first took my evidence, the second took my language, the third took my position, and I lost all 3 again on this side. In the same order, I told 2 men at the shop. Inside a month I was the guy who went down and came back with a religion, said with a little laugh at the end of it, and I understood that laugh better than they did. I had spent 3 decades perfecting it. I stopped telling people. Then I stopped correcting them. That's how a loud man ends up quiet, and it isn't peace. And when all 3 were gone, there was still someone there. That's when the shape came. I'm going to be careful here and slow, because this is the part where accounts like mine turn into something you've heard before, and I don't want your permission that cheaply. There was a figure, or the quiet took a form that my mind could tolerate. I don't know which, and 9 years of thinking about it hasn't moved me an inch. It was not glowing. It was not robed. There was nothing on it that a painter would use. What it had was a way of standing, and I knew that way of standing. I had watched it across a shop floor and across a kitchen table, and from the back seat of a Buick on the way to a lake we went to twice. Weight on the left leg, hands not doing anything. I said a word out loud in that place with no mouth, and whoever it was did not step forward and did not answer and did not let me get any closer, and I have never in my life wanted anything the way I wanted that. Then the attention moved, not away from me, deeper into me, the way a hand goes into a pocket, and everything I had ever done began to play. Everything I had ever done began to play, and I need to correct the phrase before I use it again, because life review is much too gentle a term for what that is. It is not a review. Nobody reviews anything. There is no screen, no sequence, no voice narrating your worst days back to you. You are simply put where the other person was standing. That's all it is. That's the whole mechanism. And it is the most efficient instrument I have ever encountered, and I have spent my working life around instruments. It started at the wake. Of course it did. February, ham on paper plates, my aunt with her back against the sideboard. Except I wasn't me, I was her. I was a 56-year-old woman who had buried her only sister 4 hours earlier and who was holding herself upright in that room by an act of will. And a young man she had loved since he was born came in from a field with something desperate in him and took her faith apart in front of her neighbours. I felt what that did. I want to say I felt her hurt. That's not accurate enough. I felt the specific thing, the way she went somewhere behind her own eyes and stayed there. And the way she decided, in that moment, to protect me by never bringing it up. And I heard the click from her side. That's what took the last of me apart, the sound I built my whole life on, that clean closing sound of a fact landing and ending a conversation. From the other chair, it isn't a click at all. It's a door. I tried to stop it. That was the fourth thing I tried, and the fourth thing that failed. And it failed differently. There was no resistance. It simply had no handle. You cannot decline to be where somebody was standing. There is nothing to decline with. So I tried the next move, which is the move every man reaches for eventually. I explained myself. And in that place, explanation is the strangest experience available to a human being, because your reasons are already present. Nothing is hidden. Every single thing I had ever told myself was right there, fully visible, fully understood, treated with complete seriousness, and utterly beside the point. I had wanted to be right, because being right was quiet. That was visible too. Then it took me to the hospital room, and I would give back nearly everything I own to not have been put in that chair. I was my father. 71 years old, 4 days from the end, tired in a way that has nothing to do with sleep, watching his son stand at the foot of the bed with his arms crossed and his jaw set. He wasn't afraid of what was coming. That's the thing I had wrong for 20 years. He had made his peace with the whole business. He was afraid of leaving without saying one specific thing to me. And he could see, I could see from inside him, with his eyes, that there was no opening in me for it, not one. He looked at his son's face and did the arithmetic that every parent eventually does, and he decided the message would not survive being said to that face. So he asked for a priest to carry it for him, and I called it theatre. In the room, out loud. I felt his response to that from the inside. It was not anger, not even disappointment. It was worse than both. It was tenderness with nowhere to go. That's the price. If you take one thing from a man who spent 3 decades telling people your life is meaningless matter, take that. I did not have to be punished. I only had to be moved 4 feet to the left, into the place where the people who loved me had been standing the whole time. And it wasn't only the large ones. That's the other thing nobody warns you about. There was a kid at the shop, 19, first month, holding a part out to me, like it was an offering. I corrected him in front of the line over 4/1000ths of an inch. I could not tell you his last name today. In that place I was him. And I learned that he had rehearsed talking to me in his truck that morning. And there were years of it. Marianne at the holiday table, a woman standing in a doorway at night, waiting to be asked a single question, who eventually stopped standing there. I would tell you it lasted hours. There were no hours. When it finished, I had nothing left that I would call myself. No argument, no position, no evidence, just a man who finally understood, with total clarity, exactly what he had cost the people who kept coming back anyway. And that is the state I was in when the figure that had been standing there the whole time finally moved. The figure moved, and it was my father. I need to say that plainly, once, without decoration, because I have watched myself circle it for 9 years, and the circling is cowardice. It was my father, not younger, not restored, not glowing like a card you buy at a drugstore. He was exactly as I had known him, weight on the left leg, hands not doing anything, and he was more solid than the kitchen I had left. And he was not surprised to see me. That's the detail that finishes people when I tell it. Everybody expects the reunion. Nobody expects that the person waiting has been standing there the entire time, unhurried, the way a man waits at a gate for a bus he knows the schedule of. He didn't hold me. There was nothing to hold. What happened instead is the thing I have no adequate words for, and I've had 9 years to find them. He let me be where he was standing, one more time, voluntarily, and what was, there was not a ledger of anything I had done. It was the plain, unremarkable, load-bearing fact that this man had loved me continuously, without a gap, through every single argument I ever won against everything he believed, through the wake, through the hospital room, through the sentence I said out loud at the foot of his bed. No gap, not one. If you've made it this far with me, subscribe to the channel. New stories like this one every week. Then he spoke, and here is where I have to slow down, because these are the words I promised you at the beginning. 12 days before I went down, I sat across a table from my sister and I told her there was nobody listening. Those were my exact words. Nobody listening. I'd used them for years. They were a good closer. They had the click in them. My father said them back to me. You told her there was nobody listening. Not angry, not even correcting me. He said it the way you repeat a thing a child said, months later, when the child has forgotten and you have not. And then he said the second half. I was listening. That's it. That's the whole hinge of my life. 4 words from a man 17 years gone, in a place with no walls. I was listening. And every argument I'd ever won came back to me at once, not as sin, not as error, as an empty room I'd been shouting into while somebody stood in the doorway the entire time, hearing all of it staying anyway. That is the moment the atheist died. Not on the linoleum. There. And I want to be careful, because I am not going to sell you my conclusions. I don't have a doctrine. I couldn't tell you tonight what happens to anyone but me, and I don't trust men who can. What I have is one man standing a certain way, telling me he was listening. Then he told me I was going back. I fought it, of course I fought it. I had spent my whole life fighting, and I had finally found the one place I would have stayed. I told him no. I had said no once already at the beginning, and this time I said it for the opposite reason. And I want you to sit with how humiliating that symmetry is. He didn't argue. That's not a thing that happens there. He gave me a reason. And the reason wasn't me. I want that on the record, because if this was something my brain manufactured on a kitchen floor, it would have been about me. It always had been. He said there was someone still on that side who had been carrying something for 20 years and couldn't set it down until there was somebody left who could take it from her. He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. Somewhere below me, a woman had dialed for help before there was anything to dial about, and she was doing 70 on a state route in the dark, and she had been holding our father's last sentence since she was 19 years old. And then he gave me the message, the one he had tried to hand a priest 4 days before the end, because he had looked at my face and known it wouldn't survive the trip. I'll give you that message. It's the last thing I have to give, and it belongs at the end, because right after he said it, the walls came back. That's the only way I can describe the return. Not a tunnel, not falling. The acoustics closed. Everything started bouncing again. My own pulse, the hiss of blood, the sound of my jaw, the small, loud, crowded space of being a man. And underneath it, Dale's voice and the plastic edge of something against my mouth and a fluorescent tube, and pain arriving in my chest like a bill finally coming due. Ray told me later I said one word before I could focus my eyes. He thought it was a name. It was. The word I said before I could focus my eyes was my father's first name. I had never once called him that in his life. It took my sister 5 more years to give me the rest. She had her reasons. She'd said she would tell me when I was ready. And I want you to understand that she was right to wait, because for the first 4 years, I was not converted. I was cornered. There's a difference. A cornered man will agree to anything and mean none of it. What changed was small. I stopped finishing sentences for people, that's all. That's the entire visible evidence of the most important thing that ever happened to me. A man who used to end conversations began letting them stay open. She noticed. She waited another year to be sure. Then, one evening in April, she stood in my kitchen, about 4 feet from where I went down, holding a cup of coffee she never drank. And she told me what our father said in that hospital room when she was 19 years old, and I was standing at the foot of the bed with my arms crossed. He said, "Tell him I know what he heard in that field, and tell him it was never coming to take anything from him." I need you to understand what that did to me, and I need to be exact, because exactness is the only thing I brought back intact. I never told anyone about the field, not my father, not my mother's sister, not the woman I married 5 years later. Not one human being in 31 years. That night, in the bed of my uncle's truck, was the single most private 10 seconds of my life, and I had spent every year since building a wall so tall that I could almost believe it had never happened. He knew, and it was the same sentence, word for word, in a kitchen in Ohio, out of my sister's mouth, the same thing I had been told in a place with no walls, by a man who had been waiting at a gate. Marianne didn't say anything else. She set the cup down and put her hand flat on my counter and stood there. And after a while I understood that she wasn't waiting for me to respond. She was setting something down that she'd been carrying since she was a teenager, and she needed a minute with her hands empty. I've done 3 things since that night that I'd call evidence of anything. I drove out to see my aunt. She's 87. I did not argue with her about the resurrection. I sat in her kitchen for 2 hours and let her talk about my mother, and when she cried I did not offer her a single fact. I found the kid from the shop. He's 41 now, runs his own line in Toledo, and he had no memory of the morning I ruined. That's the thing about the damage. It's rarely stored where you left it. And I answered Dale's question, 9 years late, on the phone, and there was a long silence on his end, and then he said, "Okay," in a voice that didn't sound like a man who'd been proven anything. It sounded like a man setting something down too. So here's where I've landed 9 years on, and it isn't a doctrine and it won't fit on a card. I was never arguing against God. I was arguing against a thing I met once in a field when I was 21 and grieving. A thing I decided, with no evidence, which is the joke of my whole life, had come to take something from me. Every argument after that was a wall against a visitor I had misread. And that is the part I'd hand to anyone still listening, not proof. I don't have proof, and I've made my peace with the fact that the one piece of evidence I asked for was the only thing I wasn't allowed to keep. Just this. Before you decide there's nothing there, make sure you're not just remembering how frightened you were the last time you thought there might be. There are others who came back, different people, different moments, the same threshold, each one carrying something that doesn't quite fit in the world we live in. If you want to hear them, you know where to find us. Subscribe and stay a while. And if this one reached you, leave a like so it can find the next person who needs it. I still hear the click. That's the thing nobody tells you. You don't get a new man. You get the old one with the sound turned down. I hear it when a conversation is about to close and I have the winning line ready. Only now I hear what's on the other side of it, and sometimes, late, in the few seconds before sleep, the acoustics change. Nothing bounces. The room gets very large. I don't say anything. I just listen back.